After the Trotsky faction was defeated, the economic situations in the USSR got even worse. And by 1928, at the time that Trotsky was deported, the bureaucracy of the Communist Party was forced to adopt Trotsky's program of a 5-year plan. Yeah. And so they adopted the 5-year plan of Trotsky. And they had the 1928 gathering of the International Communist Movement. They also adopted a really distorted version of his call for international revolution. And so the 1928 convention of the Communist International, the slogan was "Class against class" was the slogan, and they announced the 5-year plans. And as much as the Stalinist bureaucracy was brutal to its opponents, the 5-year plans overwhelmingly proved that socialism works as an economic system. The 5-year plans, within 5 years, the USSR went from being an impoverished, third world oppressed country into being one of the most industrial powers in the world. And you have to keep in mind, a year after they launched the 5-year plans, in 1929, the Great Depression happened. So the entire world capitalist economy was, diving below. But in the USSR, for the first time, people had food to eat. There was starvation was wiped out. People had, education, literacy was universal for the first time. There was.
When you say starvation was wiped out, this was not just an occasional event. Starvation of tens of millions of people was an annual event.
Yeah, people had, throughout Russian history, people dying, was everyday life. What would be considered a famine under the USSR was everyday occurrence. Thousands and thousands were dying every year, but for the first time during the 5-year plans, they were able to industrialize. They built power plants. They built steel. They had railroads all throughout the country. They had electricity. They had running water. And it was this plan to industrialize based on socialist planning. And it was a very, very, detailed, it was a 5-year plan. They drew it up, and we're going to build the power plants here. And they turned the USSR into a powerhouse of industry.
And not only that, this was at the same time as there was a worldwide depression going on. So what happened was that if people, let's say Americans, wanted jobs, they went to the Soviet Union to get work.
Thousands and thousands of Americans actually went to the Soviet Union.
Essentially, skilled workers, engineers. The Moscow subways were built, were designed essentially by Americans who you cannot imagine what the Soviet subway system is like unless you've seen it.
I've seen it on TV. It's beautiful.
Because, first of all, in the United States, in New York, for instance, where I come from, the subway stations are just, what can I say? They're there, but they're not gorgeous. They're functional, and that's
in
about
Russia,
it.
They're gorgeous.
But what the Soviet, the Moscow subway, for instance, is just beautiful. It's just there's artwork, etc. Or all over the subways. Somebody would say, well, why do isn't it enough for them to be functional? But this is a way of introducing classic art to the population as a whole, because people have to use it every day, to get to their job.
Yeah, just recently they restored the Moscow subways because there's unemployment, and that was a program by the modern Russian government to restore the Moscow subways, and it was extremely controversial because the original Moscow subways had a memorial to Stalin in them, so it was extremely controversial that they restored the actual memorial to Stalin, which is kind of interesting. But so the USSR was industrializing electricity, power, literacy, education, and then in the countryside, right? One of the biggest problems, and this was a problem, was that they had been telling the peasants, and the wealthy peasants, the ones who owned their own land, and some of which who even hired other peasants, the kulaks as they were called, which is Russian for fist, meant they were the tight-fisted ones, the tough guys.
I thought it meant fight imperialism, stand together.
No, no. Yeah, and they...
That's a different kulak.
That's a different kulak, yeah. Yeah, and they...
the newspaper.
Yeah, and they... Now, they've been telling the peasants, enrich yourselves, enrich yourselves. And then, when that wasn't working and there was not enough food being produced in the countryside on the basis of all of that, there was the need to collectivize. And Trotsky and Lenin had called for the Soviet Union to gradually collectivize and to gradually, offer tax incentives and gradually build up collectivization. But, the Stalin and Bukharin had opposed that. So when it came time to collectivize, they went in
forced
collectivization within a year. And so when you hear about the Ukrainian famine of 1931 and 32, what that is that they were forced to go from private farming to, collectivization within a year. And in addition to that, it was class war because the poor peasants were the ones doing a lot of the expropriation of the wealthy peasants. And so they were mobilized to attack the kulaks. And the slogan of the Communist Party was, liquidate the kulaks as a class. Meaning that within 1 year they were going to wipe out all the wealthy farmers and set up collective farms immediately. And collective farms were independent of the state. There were state farms, which are not the same as collective farms. Collective farms sold their grain to the government and in exchange got, the goods they needed and all that. They operated on an exchange basis. Now state farms were just a wing of the state planned economy. And the collective farms were operated. There was democracy to some extent, but then the party, had its, the bureaucracy was made sure it got what it wanted. But finally, in 1932, when they finally did succeed in collectivization, the collectivization fed Russia and was successful until it was finally taken apart, and we'll get to that in a little bit later. So, but finally, the collective farms were a success once they were set up. So when you hear about, I know there's a lot of propaganda, they talk about the Ukrainian Holocaust. Well, first of all, it was... Right. Well, first of all...
I have a lot of Ukrainian friends in college. They talked about it all the time.
Right. Well, first of all, it wasn't just in the Ukraine. It was all over the Soviet countryside, in Moldova, in Russia, and all of that this problem happened with the collectivization, number one. So it wasn't just in the Ukraine. And second of all, it was not a Holocaust. There were no death camps. There were no gas chambers. Okay, it was simply that they went from privately owned farms to nationalized farms within a year, and that caused a crisis. And in addition, there were just natural disasters. There was a drought that year. I mean, it was a natural disaster. And it's such hypocrisy when people say that Stalin killed millions of people. And I always want to say to people, how did he kill these millions of people? And they don't know. They just know Stalin killed millions. So I say, well, how did they kill these millions? But if you actually look in the books, they blame the millions numbers. They come from the Ukrainian famine, which was not murder. It was bad economic policy, and it was the bureaucracy making errors, but it was not a Holocaust. And to compare it to a Holocaust, and
so Stalin didn't have any secret police that he used to kill people.
Now that's different. No, that's different. There were secret police. The bureaucracy, if people opposed the bureaucracy or were the left opposition, or eventually the right opposition. There was a factor of people grouped around Bukharin who didn't agree with the 5-year plans. They wanted to continue the new economic policy. And that was after the Stalin and Bukharin bloc defeated the Trotskyists, then a section called the right opposition came into being of Bukharin. And they didn't want to industrialize. They wanted to continue the capitalist market economy. And they were taken out by Stalin as well. The secret police, the Cheka or KGB or the GPU as they're called, they were very, if you opposed Stalin, you were arrested. But you have to also keep in mind, most of these people, they didn't die when they were arrested. They were just taken to prison camps, and most of them got out within 2 years. And it was not fun. It was opposing the bureaucracy. It was the bureaucracy defending its power, ultimately.